Hey, everybody. Looks like everybody's filtering in. This is Carl Binder and Matt Linder for our webinar, Leadership and Management with the Human Touch. And we're glad to have you here. It's people are filtering in here, so we'll wait a couple minutes. But I wanted to say before, while people are still arriving, we have a downloadable file for you that I'm now sharing, and hopefully you can see that on the screen that it's being shared. It's called Performance Thinking Leadership Webinar, and it has a bunch of resources and notes that Matt created, and also it's got our white paper on leadership and management. So feel free to download that. You'll probably be able to get it on YouTube after we post this thing too, but for now, it'd be good to have it. You don't have to have it for our session, but I think it's pretty useful. Matt particularly put together some really cool sort of high points and summaries of some of the points we'll make today. So let me get going on our slides here, and be sure this works as it's supposed to. Here we go. Hopefully you can see this slide that says Leadership and Management with the Human Touch. We've got a lot of old friends here. I see. I'm just looking at the chat box. Rick Greentree and Don Gibson and Roger Addison and Jen and a whole lot of people. This is fantastic. People who I recognize. Hi, Maury. I'm really delighted today, and we'll do some introductions in a few minutes, but I'm really delighted today to have Matt Linder here, and we'll sort of introduce him shortly. But let me, again, I suggested that you download the handouts, and I'm hoping that you can click toward the right bottom of your screen and do that. So that's kind of what the two files in the single PDF look like. And here's our agenda for the day. Because we can't assume that everybody's been in any of these webinars before or knows about our work, we're going to do an overview of performance thinking and how it applies to leadership and management. I'm going to try to make it brief. For me, that probably means 20 minutes, but it's still an overview so you'll understand the context that we're talking about. And if you want more, you can go to some of our other resources, as I'll point you to. And then we want to talk a little bit toward the end of that about how we think about best practices for leaders and managers organized using our model, the 6 boxes model. And then basically, Matt and I are going to have a conversation, and I'm real excited about that for a whole lot of reasons. I've already learned a bunch of stuff from Matt, and I was saying earlier when he and I were talking, I love it when I meet a colleague and they say things which, as soon as they say it, you say, of course that's true. It makes perfect sense. But you hadn't thought about it or articulated it that way before. And I think you're going to hear some stuff like that today. And then we'll have some Q&A time at the end. We're going to try to go for an hour. We might go a few minutes over an hour if we're kind of mid-topic. But we do record these sessions, and everybody who registered for it will get a link to the recording. So don't worry if you have to drop off. I know that people set aside an hour for these things sometimes. I also want to point you to a few things. A previous webinar that we did on what is leadership, what is management, was a whole hour devoted to the topic, the sort of background, the models, the approach that we're coming from. And you can find that at our YouTube channel. Easy way to find our YouTube channel is performancethinking.tv, except there's an extra dot in there. It should just be one word, performance thinking. I just noticed that. So if you want background, you can go there. And then I want to tell you a little bit about our next session. I'm extremely excited about the next webinar we're going to do on March 7th. It's going to feature another colleague, my friend Bill Blunt. And I've known Bill for a long time, and we'll tell you more about him when we get there. But Bill's going to tell us about how he started as one person with a small team in learning and performance, working in a global biotech company. And after a number of years, through what he describes as viral spread, now his successor took over some years ago, and there are almost 300 certified performance thinking practitioners, people who are performance consultants all over that company. And it's maybe not so cool to talk about viruses these days. That's why I called it the good virus. But there's literally the notion of change management from the inside out. And so it's going to be a really interesting topic, I think, both related to the fact that our performance thinking models and language are easy to disseminate because it's plain English and people get it pretty fast. but also that you can be proactive about that in the way that Bill was. So this is going to be really cool. And you can actually go to our website, and there's a little button that says register for the webinars. And so if you want to register for that one, you can do it. And we got a lot more topics coming up, not necessarily in this sequence, but I had a company for a decade in Boston that was focused on sales enablement, and we're working on that again now these days. I'm working with Barbara Buckland and some other colleagues. So at some point, we're going to talk about how to manage content or knowledge for sales. We're going to talk about the second topic is pretty controversial, but I would say the trouble with competency modeling, which is all over the place, but in my view, there's some issues that we need to talk about. And you can see these other topics, but there's a bunch of cool stuff that I think we're going to be getting into over the next few months that really have ramifications from performance thinking, implications from that. So those are some future topics. Also, shameless commerce moment, if you go to our website, you will find we have a whole bunch of programs and services, and you can get, if you go to Programs and Services tab, you'll find this. And what I've highlighted here is we have a bunch of things for leaders and managers. We've got our coaching program, which is the basic tool set that we teach people about how to coach individuals. And then we have some modules for leaders as their scope of their, of their influence expands. We also have a very special executive coaching process. We're just getting going. And of course, as you'll learn, Matt has an entirely different set of executive coaching sort of approaches that are really cool also. He's not part of our company at this point, but trying to put out the tractor beam to work more closely with Matt, let's put it that way. And then we have our summer institutes and our and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff for people interested in leaders and managers. And also, again, I mentioned our YouTube channel, performancethinking.tv. There's a lot of stuff there. So that's kind of the background. My name's Carl Binder, as I guess is obvious from the front page. I'm the CEO of the Performance Thinking Network. I started out in the 70s as a student with B.F. Skinner, so I was grounded in behavior science, and I did instructional research and did work in what was called precision teaching that some of you might know about, and also fluency-based instruction, which in the 80s I then brought into the corporate world at the prompting, rather aggressive prompting by my late mentor, Og Lindsley. Started doing fluency-based training for sales and customer service, and then that expanded to performance improvement. And so Matt, who I just want to talk a little bit about and then let him introduce himself, we share a background in behavior science. One of the things about Matt is he's a experienced, seasoned executive. He knows how to get stuff done and how to grow organizations. My experience so far is this man sort of has behavior science deeply embedded in how he approaches everything, whether he's using the jargon at any moment or not. And I got to give a shout out to my friend Brett DeNovi, who introduced me to Matt when Matt was executive vice president at Brett's company. So thank you, Brett, if you happen to see this. But I've gotten to know Matt now for a while, and I'm struck by his ability to connect with people, to be sensitive to other people. And the thing I want to mention, I always like to have little fun facts about people. I learned the other day that Matt is both a poker player and a chess player. Now, I find that very interesting because poker players, of course, they got to have a poker face. And that's good if you're a leader manager and you're concerned or upset or emotional about something, but you don't want to let on. It's also really good because you get very skilled at looking at other people's faces and getting their tells. So if you want to get sensitive to other people, try becoming a good poker player. But then again, chess is interesting because chess is about looking at options and being strategic. And so Matt's got both of those things, not just in chess and poker, but also I think in his professional life. So anyway, Matt, you want to take a few moments to talk about yourself or introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. A very gracious introduction, Carl. I appreciate it. I started down the behavior science road before I knew I was. I think as a lot of people do in that field. And you start doing things, and it came to me that I was just questioning why they were working. And as I looked more into it, I pursued an education in that. And then found myself working with Brett in a company that was scaling rapidly. And, this company went from 30 to 600 people in 5 years. And I was in the business of training leaders, making more leaders. That was really what I did more than anything else there, as well as working on integrative systems and a lot of change management stuff as we scaled. And, it just became something that I got super passionate about. And, ended up starting my own company to do more of this and help other people be successful in the same ways. So yeah, and I appreciate the invite today, Carl. I'm super excited for our conversation.
Good deal. Thank you, Matt. That's great. People will get to understand who this man is after a while, and we start having a conversation. So I'd like to know a little bit about you all, and the way we typically do that is with a poll. So I'm going to start this poll, and what it asks you to do is indicate, kind of try to peg yourself. Are you a senior leader? Are you a middle manager? Are you a frontline supervisor or manager? Or maybe is your job to develop or coach leaders and managers? Just a second, I guess I got to publish that, don't I? Are you an HR business partner, which is a role in some big companies that can have quite an impact on leadership and managers? Are you a coach of some kind or other? We don't know what other. So there's a lot of senior leaders. That's kind of interesting. And there's a mix of other folks. There's a fair number of leadership and management development folks, it looks like. What else we got? It's always interesting to watch these things play out. Looks like it might be fairly stable now. Well, you're still responding. I'm curious what other is. But if anybody wants to tell us what other is, you can put it in the chat box when we're done with this. Frontline supervisors. So yeah, clearly frontline supervisors and managers. One of the interesting things is the name of Matt's company is Desired Effect Coaching Solutions. And that phrase I particularly like because it's about how does what you do, does it actually have the desired effect? So I'm going to end the poll. I think we're supposed to be able to share this, but I'm not sure that it just got shared or not. I'm afraid it might not have. But what I can tell you is about a quarter of you are senior leaders. There's another maybe 20% who are frontline supervisors and managers, a few middle managers, and then there's quite a few people who develop managers and leaders. So that's helpful for us to know who's in the room for sure. So, this company, Performance Thinking, the Performance Thinking Network, that was my old company. But the Performance Thinking Network, I really started my career wanting to bring the principles and discoveries of behavior science and also human performance technology or human performance improvement to everybody. So we wanted to cut through the jargon, the complexity, and all of that. And so that's what I'm going to try to give you now is a very quick overview of the elements of performance thinking and a little bit about where it came from, so that then when Matt and I start speaking and we talk about boxes and the 6 boxes model and so forth, it will make some sense to you. Basically what arose for me in the 80s and the 90s when this really started getting going, the first part was not a new idea, which is that we wanted to be able to analyze and communicate about human performance in ways that were actionable and evidence-based. And there's a lot of methodologies out there for that. There's people who do organizational behavior management that does some of that. There are people in the human performance improvement or human performance technology world. There's people who do process improvement. There's a whole lot of methodologies out there, but they tend to be kind of complicated. And so they tend to be sort of specialists. But what we realized, and some of this was under the influence of Steve Jobs, actually, because I studied him from early on, was that if we use simple visual models in plain language that anybody could understand, that we could then communicate across all levels and functions in organizations about the elements of performance improvement, to build communities of practice so that people share, even across silos, how they're going to approach a problem, whether they're leaders and managers or training professionals or process improvement folks, so that they could drive collaboration and performance, continuous performance improvement. And the name of the company and our trademark, Performance Thinking, actually came out of clients maybe 15 years ago when they started saying, you guys are teaching us a methodology, but you're really teaching us a way to think. And so I think, as you'll see, and many of you are already familiar with this, but I think as you'll see, the models and the language of this work allow you actually to view the world differently. And so then you can apply it formally in they do at Amgen, for example, in 2 or 3 year long global projects that involve all kinds of stuff, or you can apply it informally in a conversation at the water cooler where you're trying to help somebody get better at producing something that's valuable to the organization. So that's kind of the core idea, to make it accessible. And what we recognized after a few years of doing this and refining our models and language was that we really answered three questions that I think, whether you're a performance professional, like in training and development or process improvement or change management, or as we're discussing today, a leader, manager, supervisor, you got to have crisp, clear answers to these three questions. First of all, what is human performance? Now that might sound stupid at first, like, what do you mean? I know what that is. But if you are in a room and you ask people, well, how would you define human performance? You'll get a lot of answers. You'll get people saying, well, behaving to produce results, or you get people saying, well, we're trying to achieve the company's results, or maybe we're trying to have accomplishments, or there's all these different words and phrases, all of which are probably true. But the problem is, as we say in behavior science, we need units of analysis. We need a crisp way to look at performance, understand what the elements are so that we can manage them, define them, set expectations for performance, improve them, and so forth. So you'll see our answer to that is a simple model called the performance chain. And then the second question is, what influences human performance? And if you're in the leadership and management world, depending on what book you've read or what workshops you've been to recently, who knows what that is? It could be all kinds of things. These days, it's mindset. People say, oh, well, you have to have a winning mindset or whatever. But it could just as easily be better processes or training or mentoring or whatever. So people have these long lists of what influences human performance. And as you'll see, our answer is boiled down to a simple model we call the 6 boxes model, that was derived from Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, that was derived from B.F. Skinner's 3-term contingency. So we have a very clear, we think, powerful and comprehensive model that answers that. And then the third one is, okay, so you got answers to those things. Now what do you do with it? And so we have a logic that we describe that I'll show you really quickly. So as I mentioned, Tom Gilbert, he was a mentor to me, and he was a major pioneer really in the field of human performance improvement, human performance technology. And he made a radical statement back in the 70s and in his famous book, Human Competence. He said, in the great cult of behavior, and he wasn't talking about behaviorists, he was talking about leaders, managers, trainers, all of us that look at behavior. It's in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, some people in this group have heard me say this a bazillion times, so you might be falling asleep at this moment. But it's important to recognize, whether you've ever heard this before or not, the truth of it, which is that when we're in an organization, what we care about is what people contribute to the organization, their accomplishments, their contributions. We call them work outputs, but they're the products of behavior. That's what's valuable. And once we define those, we can then figure out what behavior is necessary, and we can figure out how to support that behavior. But Tom Gilbert shifted, like in a seismic way, the focus from behavior to accomplishments. And so we have this model called the performance chain. And it really, again, came from Gilbert and Harless and other thought leaders that I had the benefit of being mentored by. But it says that the right 3 blocks on that chain are the elements of performance. That is, performance is behavior, which is activity of some kind, that produces what we call work outputs. It's our phrase for accomplishments because we want to be sure that work outputs are countable and measurable. And those work outputs are valuable to the extent that they contribute to business results. So whether we're performance consultants or leader managers, whether we're doing it formally or informally, we're always looking at performance through the lens of those 3 elements. Like what's at stake here for the organization? What do people need to produce to contribute to that? And what do they need to do for that? So we could spend days on that topic, but that's the elements of what performance is. That's how we answer that question. And when we apply it to leadership and management, what we're trying to do is figure out the individual sitting in front of me, the team I'm leading or managing, the department or the whole organization with all of its processes. What are the valuable contributions or outputs, work outputs that need to be produced to make the thing work? So that's how we go after it. And as an informal coach, even, we'll sit down and say, well, what are you trying to produce here? A decision, a relationship, a document, a plan, a widget? What is it? Once we know that, we can do a lot. And then what influences human performance? And this is actually Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, but it was derived from Skinner's work. The top row there for those of you who have a background in behavior science may recognize it. Discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses that hopefully are followed by reinforcing stimuli. Some people have plain English that a lot into antecedents, behavior, and consequences. And Tom Gilbert said, wait a minute, that applies when all organisms are the same, like white Carnot pigeons starved to 80% body weight. But persons, are individuals. They vary a lot. So what he did is he said, we can take those three categories and we can look at what's in the environment. He called it data. We can look at what's in the environment that enables us to respond, which he called instruments, the physical and social and human resource environment stuff we have. And you can look at the consequences and call those incentives. But what he recognized was that the individual comes to the table with pre-existing repertoire. He called that knowledge. They come better suited for some jobs or roles than others. He called that capacity. In other words, how we match people up to their jobs or tasks and so forth. And then he said, wait a minute, we better understand people's motives, because as Skinner understood, you can define a consequence as something you think might increase behavior, but you can't call it a reinforcement or a reinforcer until you demonstrate that it actually works. And similarly, we can arrange incentives, but if they don't line up with people's motives, it ain't going to work. I studied with Skinner, and then I learned Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model. But the problem was when we started sharing this with our clients, with the people in the organizations we were serving, we got like, what is that again? What data are you talking about? What do you mean by instruments? So there was confusion about the language, and there were a lot of errors. So I worked for probably 5 years in the 80s, and developed what we ultimately, one of our clients called the 6 boxes model, so we adopted it. But these are the same categories that Gilbert had, but their language that over time we refined until we could introduce this to people and they didn't make category mistakes. And so we can show this language to just about anybody, from a CEO of a multinational corporation to a supervisor in a 5-person ABA service and any place in between, to frontline high school educated small manufacturing workers, you name it. And with a little bit of instruction, they begin to use this framework in a way that identifies what actually influences behavior. So that's our answer to the question, what influences behavior? And this is a popular model. A lot of people really like it. But it's important to notice that until you identify the work outputs and the behavior need to produce them, this really isn't is powerful. So we need to start out with that first part, defining performance. And then finally, we talk about performance improvement logic. So what does that mean? So this is the answer to how do we actually manage and improve performance, whether we're doing big projects or working with an individual. So we just sort of stick those two models together. It wasn't obvious. The 6 boxes model is the way we kind of organize behavior influences. And then we say, let's be sure when we're talking to somebody or planning a project, we know what the business results are. We know what's at stake. Is this about profits or market share or customer satisfaction or employee engagement, or what is it, And once we know that, then we say, okay, what do the individuals or teams or processes need to produce of value to contribute to those business results? So what are the outputs? That's the next step. And we want to know what good looks like. And once we know that, it becomes a heck of a lot easier to pinpoint the behavior, because now we can do a task analysis, or we can observe successful performers, or we can grab best practices from really stars, and we can define the behavior in a way that's rather precisely focused on producing those work outputs with the highest levels of quality and quantity and so forth. And once we got that, we got stuff to measure. So we can say, let's look at this. We know we can measure business results, and they're kind of lagging indicators, but we probably ought to pay attention to that. We know we can measure behavior. It's sometimes expensive to do that because you got to watch people and so forth, but we can do it. And we can identify work outputs, and we can count good ones. And that, in our view, is one of the more powerful measurement options. In fact, we just put up a thing in our LinkedIn group today. Guy Wallace did a nice little interview with me the other day on measurement, and we talk about that. Once you know what you're measuring to figure out how it's working, now we look at the behavior influences. And if we're in a big project, we go through a systematic analysis with a bunch of people to see what behavior influences are working to support the desired behavior, what's getting in the way, what's missing. If we're talking to an individual that we're coaching, we have the same discussion. We say, well, are you clear? How are you getting your expectations for that? How about feedback? Is that working for you? Can you use more? Is it corrective? Is it positive? How about the tools and resources? So we basically go through a discussion about what's the current state of behavior influences if it's existing performance. And then we said, how can we improve? Let's brainstorm some ways we can improve those things because they all fit together. Let's tweak the things so we can come up with the best combination. And then what can we agree? What should we do? And if we're coaching somebody, it's very informal. It's like, okay, well, we'll meet again next week, but I'll try to give you some more feedback and I'll introduce you to Jack over there who knows how to do this and he'll show you some stuff. And I got a job aid here you might find helpful. In other words, we agree on some things to do. If it's a big 3-year project, we have a whole plan that probably passes muster with committees and stuff. But in any case, this is the logic of what we're applying. Now, if you shift that to the topic of leaders and managers, you say, okay, what do leaders and managers do? Well, the big thing that the webinar a month ago was the fact that leaders and managers aren't just the smartest person on the team. They aren't just the, heavy duty person in the group. They actually have to shift their role to arranging behavior influences to support and enable the people who they manage. So they're trying to arrange conditions so that the people that work for them, that they lead or manage, will be optimally productive and also hopefully optimally engaged, will like their work. And one way to think about this, there's a phrase out there I'm sure many of you have heard, servant leadership. And after probably a half hour of conversation with Matt, I just got some feedback that that this is freezing for some people, so I'm not sure. I hope it's okay for you guys. It's getting recorded, I'm pretty sure. In any case, we've always said that the leader or manager lives in box 2 as a resource to his or her people and arranges conditions for other people. And within a half an hour of my talking to Matt about his perspective on leadership and management, I realized he's a servant leader, whether he says that or not, and that servant leadership really is about being a resource to your people, not hanging out in your office looking at spreadsheets all the time, and arranging conditions in all the other boxes so people can perform well. If you do that in a big organization or a small one, you can drive agile talent development. That is, you can define expectations for performance, you can onboard people or help to do so, you can contribute to, or maybe the training department contributes to job readiness by enabling people to produce the outputs that they need. And then you can move people into an ongoing coaching or mentoring cycle where you do what we were talking about a couple minutes ago in an ongoing way to develop people. And if you put that kind of a process in place in your organization using a coaching program or coaching methodology that's focused on accomplishments, then you can keep up with the pace of change much faster than having your learning management system that people check into every quarter or whatever. All this down, and this is something we'll come back to, but really sets the context for Matt. You can see that the things that leaders and managers do, the best practices for leaders and managers, sort into this framework. And so that in box 1, a good leader manager articulates a vision, links that vision to strategy, aligns expectations, etc. So you can look at this in some detail. If it's a recording, you can pause it and look at it. But the idea is, as a leader or manager, you're arranging these conditions to optimize the performance of your people. So that all sounds great. And it's very engineering-like. And in fact, engineers really take to this stuff because they say, oh, I can do this, this all makes sense. But the question is, how do we do it? As we're humans. There's more to it than that. It's not just engineering. And so what I was struck by as I began to get to know Matt is that he has a lot of insights about how to do those things. So I'm going to stop the slides right now so we can just be fully on the screen. And then I want to just start kind of a dialogue with Matt. So we're a little bit bigger on the screen now. So paradoxically, even though box 6 is the last box in the model, my former partner really changed my life about 15 years ago when she said, wait a minute, as a leader and manager, we need to start with box 6. We need to understand people's motives and preferences. so that we can manage all the rest of it. And so, Matt, a question for you is, we've talked a lot in the past, and I know a lot of it is about knowing who you're leading and managing and knowing essentially people's motives and preferences. So how do you think about that? And what are some of the ways you think about taking people's motives and preferences into account?
Yeah. So it's one of the first things that I ever do when I meet somebody, when I start working with them, when we kind of build any sort of relationship, just like you do with friends or, family or anything like that you haven't seen for a while, is you need to get to know the person or re-know them in some circumstances, on a very individual level. And that doesn't necessarily mean, knowing their favorite color or knowing their favorite vacation place or any other security questions that might come up for their bank. It has to do more with kind of understanding what makes them go. So one of the first places I start is I'll start by talking to somebody, especially if it's professionally, about their career history. Where did they come from and where are they going? And dig into detail, really, like, all right, you were at this place for 3 years. What made you start looking for, a new position somewhere else? What made you leave? And on the other side, what drew you to where you ended up going? That really helps me kind of flush out their propensity for positive reinforcement. Are they somebody who's looking to achieve things and earn them and move forward and grow? Or are they somebody who didn't want to do their previous job and the new job just isn't that one? Because really understanding negative versus positive reinforcement and what makes somebody go can be unbelievably helpful.
That's an interesting one, because I've certainly spoken with people who've been in jobs for a few years, and they'll say, I kind of learned everything I could do there, and I want more. I'm kind of bored with my thing. I want to do something else. And I think, you hear that and you say, ooh, maybe I can offer that to you. Or, there's other examples. I was working with some engineers at one point where we were developing managers, and this one guy said, I have this woman who works for me, and she's a single mom, and we have lots of reward systems and awards and stuff around here. But but she's a single mom. She likes to be home when her kids come home from school, and normally can't do that. So what I know is, if we finish a project on time and she does a great job, I'll say, hey, take flex time next week, because she can be home with her kids, and she'd rather have that than $1,000 check. And so to me, that's kind of a clever example of a small thing about somebody. Say, oh, they care about that. Let's try to help in that regard. So that's
it's very individualized
with what you're saying.
Yeah, it's very individualized. This can't be something that you treat everybody that you work with or lead in the same manner. When we first bought this house, first house I ever owned, and we had to get a lawnmower. And I got this lawnmower on Craigslist because we had no money, because we just bought a house, right? And this thing, worked a couple times really well, and then it broke down, and it was, cycling poorly, and I couldn't afford to have somebody fix it or buy a new lawnmower, so I had to learn how this lawnmower worked. I watched some videos, and I took it apart, and spoiler alert, it was the carburetor that was all clogged up. Cleaned that up, put it back together, and it worked great for years and years. But it doesn't mean that I know how to fix every lawnmower. It doesn't mean that I can just go ahead and do something and something's going to work better. I had to learn how it worked first. And that's the same with people. You have to understand how they work, how they go about things, and like you said, what's important to them in order to be able to connect with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. So let's say we do a good job as a leader or manager, understanding not just the individuals, but even the group. Like, companies have different cultures, right? Some cultures are very collective and everybody's in the team. Some are very individualized. I've been a consultant to one of the larger high-tech companies some years ago, and everybody there was into personal brand and marketing themselves. Everybody was into getting the next job and rising. There's different cultures. And so you also learn culturally what people value. So if we talk about you get motives and preferences, then we go back to box one and expectations and feedback. And so first of all, that affects how you're going to give expectations and feedback, right? So for example, I've done a lot of work in Korea, and I've done work in people from the UK. And those are cultures that are, in the case of Korea, historically very collective. So if you called out an individual in a meeting, and said, you know, Mr. Kim, you did a great job on that, that might be embarrassing to that person because they're used to being part of the team. Whereas if you did that in the US, the person would say, yeah, I did a great job, didn't I? So there's cultural differences, or there's differences in individuals who don't actually like to be highlighted. But if you took them into your office and said, you know, you did a great job in that, I really appreciate it. I don't want to make a big deal of it because I know you get a little embarrassed by that, but it's great. You take those things into account. But so you start thinking about box one. And for me, at least personally, as a leader and manager over the years, I'm an impatient person. And I very often think people get it. Or shifting to being a performance consultant, I've also done a lot of consulting in organizations where we're analyzing what went wrong with performance. And you talk to the managers and they say, well, I was very clear about the expectations for my people. They shouldn't have any doubt about that at all. And then you go talk to the people and they say, I don't really know what he's talking about because we're very confused. So there's a whole lot of things in there about setting expectations and being sure people are on the same page. How do you approach that? What do you think about that?
I mean, there's one little trick that I learned that can be unbelievably helpful in these circumstances. You know, you set out all of these expectations for, let's say, a project or for a week or whatever it is for somebody's work. And it can even translate to when you send out procedures company-wide, and just requiring that they respond actively with a unique response. You send this whole long procedure, right? And it's got 15 different points. What's the biggest, most important takeaway that they need to understand after going through that? And just mobilize their attention for that one thing, because that is going to be the pivotal component that really is going to help them the most and help the company the most, and have them respond with it. You know, usually it'll just be like, we'll send it out and it'll be a video or a paper. And then they come back with a multiple choice question. They just have to answer something. It's not a true false. It's not a yes or no question. It is, you know, a sentence, and you have to pretty much sum up the main point of whatever you just read. And that can be really, really helpful. Mobilizes attention and forces a response, which is a different modality for them to be able to identify that they understand at least one or two or whatever expectations.
There's a thing that I think often happens in projects and meetings too, where, and it's consistent with what you're just saying, but where you kind of lay out all the objectives and you say, okay, everybody's doing this stuff. You end the meeting and you assume everybody's going to go off and know kind of what they do. But as you well know, sometimes it's like, oh, you didn't know that's what we were having you do? So how do you be sure people know kind of what their assignments are even at that level?
Just a little bit of repetition, and then have it be multimodal. Different people learn differently. I'm very much an auditory learner. I learned that early on, and my parents can speak to this, with how much I liked to read when I was a young kid. I didn't like to read at all. And then I found content that I really enjoyed and started reading that. But now even I prefer audiobooks. I retain information better. I'm able to follow it better. And I don't get distracted as easily. So just because you say something to somebody doesn't mean that they're going to understand it or retain it in an auditory fashion. I almost always have a record of decisions for when we're having those meetings, so that it is written down, so they can read it. And I like to have people repeat back what they're doing at the end of a meeting. But you have to be careful with that, because you don't want to be condescending. It's not like, all right, Carl, what's your job next week? You know, don't be like that about it. You can tee it up in a very natural way, where we're just, you know, closing the book on things, quick rehash before we break. And that just has us revisit those points that we've gone through throughout the meeting. And there's a permanent product. I usually like it emailed or on a shared drive or something like that afterwards.
Yeah, that's a big deal from my perspective, because I just always try to be sure, like you say, you have to be not, you know, you don't want to be condescending, but I always try to be sure that, so what did we just agree on? And let's get clear on this. I want to be sure we understand each other. I mean, you can have that conversation with people, and if they can tell you back what the expectation is, that's a pretty good sign that at least they probably know what what you've agreed upon. I'm looking at a couple of questions in the chat box that we can grab quickly. Probably one of them is from Michelle about how do you prevent discrimination or accusations that there's discrimination when we reinforce based on individuals' preferences. That's kind of an HR question, I think. What do you think about that? I don't want to put you on the spot, Matt.
No, it's fine. I saw it earlier. I found it really interesting that, it talks a little, there's a little bit of a point of equity in there to making sure that you're not treating anybody unfairly or somebody above others. When I understand those things and understand reinforcement for people I work with and I'm leading and coaching, it's not so much to provide it as many like consequence-based reinforcers as it is to set the stage for how we set up them for success, structuring how we have them exceed their own expectations and our own to grow and progress and improve. Like that's really more where I understand those components, because it changes how I coach and train and teach.
Mm-hmm. So I'm really glad you said that, because having come into this world as a behaviorist back in the 70s, there's a lot of talk about extrinsic consequences, good job or money or whatever it is. Nothing wrong with any of that stuff. But what I've always thought, especially in the 6 boxes framework, is what we're trying to do is arrange all of those factors so that the person successfully produces whatever it is we're asking them to produce, and they can feel good about it. So people would call that natural consequences, which I think is what you just pointed out. We're trying to arrange conditions so people will make contact with the payoff of doing a good job, essentially. And if that doesn't work at all with them consistently, then you might ask, is it a good fit? You might want to have a conversation. Do you care about what we're doing here? Is the mission of the company important? Is there other stuff I could assign you in your job? I have a relatively new colleague that I'm managing now, and I know he loves technology. So I'm trying to find opportunities for him to use some of the technology tools that we use in our business, because he likes it, the work needs to get done. I think Michelle's question, I might have, the thing about flex time might have taken us off in that direction, because that sounds like a big deal. It would be discriminatory. But if you're working in an organization where that's a possibility, it's just that in some projects it's not. I think there's some discretion about how you can do that without anybody feeling, some people would rather just work 9 to 5 and they don't actually want flex time. So obviously you have to take those issues into account. But I think, keeping in mind what Matt said, I think it's, whether I'm tell somebody how well they did 1-to-1 in my office or in a group probably would not be called out as a discriminatory thing. So you have to keep that in mind. The other thing, I wanted to respond quickly. Al asked if the slides will be available. They will not be. We don't share our slides, but we do. The recording will be. And if you go to performancethinking.tv, there's both large, presentations in video, and there's short ones in various topics. So I'm pretty sure you can share those easily with your colleagues, and they'll. And also Matt's handout has a lot of good stuff in it. So communication, and that's where also I like your phrase, Matt, desired effect. Because what you're trying to do is set expectations or communicate with people in a way that actually works, as opposed to just you feel like you got it off your chest or whatever. Okay, sort of moving right along in the 6 boxes a little bit. If you think of yourself as a resource, as a leader or manager, living in box 2, so to speak, the question that actually Matt raised for me when we first started talking about doing this webinar was a really interesting one, which is, why should people listen to us? That is, why, I'm sure we've all been in organizations or talked to people who say, don't listen to the boss. He has no idea what he's talking about, or he's a jerk, or all you can expect from that person is negative BS or whatever. So that's kind of not what we want as leaders and managers. So from your perspective, having developed a lot of leaders and managers, Matt, how do you make yourself somebody that somebody wants to follow and listen to?
Well, I didn't really start doing it in an active fashion either. It starts for me kind of just treating people with respect, and it's something that can be tough to operationalize, but you can follow the golden rule and all that sort of stuff. But listening is a huge component of that. I said to you the other day, speaking starts with listening, and that's an interesting kind of thing to wrap your head around, because so many times when we're talking in conversations, people are very focused on what they're going to say next. And they're like, all right, cool. When I get my chance, I'm gonna say this, and you're missing everything along the way. It's just like totally missing every which way. And when you're listening to somebody, you're really able to focus on like one of those principles of legitimacy that Malcolm Gladwell talks about, which is, being heard and having a voice. And even beyond that, having the people that you lead see that you hear their voice and you're putting things into action. Because saying, I hear you, I'm listening is one thing, but actually having their words change your behavior can be incredibly powerful. That's a great spot to start. There's a couple other things you can do too. Like, I'm big on directness and saying what I mean and meaning what I say, because disingenuousness it can be very toxic when it comes to any type of relationship, where you're not quite sure where you stand with somebody. You're not entirely certain whether or not they're telling you the truth or they're being straight with you. And taking that all off the table just creates a safer space to be able to discuss things. And it's a lot more efficient too, instead of having to wonder and play games and all that.
It's true. It's, I'm reminded something you said a minute ago of something that my late friend and mentor, Don Tosta, used to talk about. He talked about how people become cynics. And cynics are people who have a lot of energy that's very negative. And very often they're people that say, don't listen to management, you can't trust them, blah, blah, blah. And our way of thinking about that is, if I set expectations in box one, and then I don't give you the resources that you need to accomplish it, or I pull the rug out from under you after a while because I've shifted my attention to something, or if you kill yourself and succeed and nobody notices, you do that enough times to a person and they don't trust you anymore. They don't feel respected. They don't feel listened to, acknowledged, recognized, et cetera, et cetera. And so one way to think about, sort of in a macro way in the 6 boxes, is to say, you said, do what you say and say what you do, or et cetera, follow up, is the notion of, if you set expectations or ask somebody or set a goal or whatever, support them by being sure they do as much as you can, have the resources as necessary, and be sure that somebody notices, or that you notice when they say something. And what you were just saying about being heard, that's down to a very small micro level, which is, and we've talked about this, you've made this suggestion before, which is you get ideas or brainstorming in a meeting. When you wind up doing a few of those people and people know they said that, that's like, oh, the boss is listening. So I think that carries a lot of weight, and it's a subtle thing, but it makes a big difference.
Right on the other side of that too. I mean, with like kind of deferring that praise and saying this person came up with that, it's important for leaders. And we've talked before about how leadership doesn't have to be hierarchical within an organization, but a lot of times it is. And when you have a team of people, it's really important. And when something that's corrective or not so positive or critical comes down, kind of on that cynic topic, that you take accountability for your team. If you're any type of sports team or a sports fan, you see the coaches out there, when they have a bad game, the good coaches, they will say, that's on me. My game plan wasn't good enough. I didn't adapt to whatever their scheme was. This is 100% on me. They take accountability. They don't point out players and say that person threw an interception or this person did that. That can be, that's the fastest and easiest way to lose the respect of your team, is to start throwing them under the bus or using them as a human shield.
Yeah, that's a good point. Jeffrey in the chat box raised an issue about hierarchy. And there's a lot of things you can say about hierarchy, but another thing we've talked about before is, you can't assume just because you're the boss, you have this position where people will listen to you. If anything, that's the whole servant leadership notion. If anything, you have to bend over backwards to be sure people see that you're supporting them and all of that. So I think it's interesting, because clearly, if you got a meeting and nobody's running the meeting, it's a little bit hard for it to work. So there needs to be somebody who's managing, supervising, chairing, whatever it is. And so that's a real function. But job titles by level, naive people sometimes who first become managers or leaders get all arrogant about it, and it's exactly the opposite of what they ought to be doing, I think. So that's kind of obvious when stated, but I think it's worth saying.
It's good to think about that. Your team doesn't work for you; you work for them, and if you adopt that type of mantra or guiding principle, it kind of flips the script and changes the paradigm as to how you look at things. And it's a really useful way to look at things, different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, moving right along, there's so much we could talk about here. I wish we had a lot more time, but there's another topic that you and I've talked a little bit about, and it has to do with emotions and communication. When either there's dissent in a group or when you yourself get that email or have that meeting and you're sort of pissed off or whatever, that's probably where your poker face helps. But how do you think about that? Because I think leaders or managers, I know in my own case, I'm very impatient. And I can get something and I'll get all riled up about it and I'll write an email or get ready to talk to somebody. And if I click send, 80% of the time, I'm sorry I did it. So how do you manage emotions in an effective way?
Well, this came, I mean, a lot of this is experience based, and in one of my first leadership positions, I wasn't so good about guarding my emotions, and it got injected into what I was doing. I would get frustrated with people and angry, and that would bleed through into my tone and volume and words. And when, I moved on from that position to another one, I kind of vowed that I wasn't going to do that again. I was never going to lose my temper with anybody. I wasn't going to let them see how frustrated I was. Because as frustrated as I am, they're probably just as frustrated. And you got two angry people trying to communicate on something, nothing's going to get done. Nobody's listening to anybody because the other person's compromised by emotions. So, I just try to take a step back and say, when have I ever listened to anybody else who's angry? Immediately my mind goes to, why are they angry? Why are they yelling? Why did they use those words? I'm not thinking about anything they're saying. So, just to try to have, like you said, like that desired effect, you need to have somebody who's willing to listen to you, and they're not going to listen to an angry person. But on your point about some of the emails, I can vividly remember some of those emails I have gotten over the years that get my blood boiling. And my favorite way to handle those is I'll sit down and I'll write a response. And that response, well, first, before you even start writing the response, delete the to line of your email so you don't accidentally send it. And I write out this email, and it's filled with all of my emotions and, just laden with profanity and all this sort of stuff. And I'll let it sit for 24 hours. And then I will come back 24 hours later, a little bit calmer, and I'll read it. And I'll try to read it from the perspective of the other person who sent their email. Mm-hmm. And I say, what in here can I misinterpret when it comes to tone? Because tone in textual communication is so, just absolutely not objective. It's the most subjective thing possible, because you take on your own emotions and inject them into their tone. And I'll rewrite it, or I don't send it. But I very infrequently will send it as written. Because I've done that a couple of times, and you learn.
Yeah, and I don't know how many times I've had this moment where I thought, I don't know if this is the right thing, but I'm in a hurry, and I go click save, and guaranteed when you have that little guy in the back saying, oh, I want to do this, and then you do it, it almost always winds up trouble. I had a colleague years ago, a friend, who always used to say, when you're looking at emails or communications in written form to people, get rid of the adjectives. And I thought that was a really cool idea, because if you get rid of the adjectives, it very often takes a lot of that emotional kind of stuff out that can easily be misinterpreted or maybe correctly interpreted as, anger or what have you. Okay, well, we've only got a few more minutes. I'm just trying to look at some of the other topics. Couple things. One is consensus and dissent. Now, one of the things that you and I have talked about is the fact that sometimes you come in and you say, we have to get consensus, and I'm not going to leave the room until everybody agrees. And for example, Barack Obama used to get criticized for that his meetings would go on forever, and it's like, come on, you need a decision. So there's one point of view that says leaders ought to be the ones that are the deciders. It was George Bush, I think, who said he was the decider. But anyway, on the other hand, you've pointed out to me that there's always another option. There's always room for further discussion. So how do you think about balancing having everybody on board, versus at some point we got to decide this thing, whether everybody's on board or not? How do you manage that one?
Well, I think part of it comes from a mindset, and a lot of times we think of yes, no, true, false, do, do not, and very binary circumstances. So when it comes to decisions, I think that there's no binary decisions. There's not a situation where it's a yes, no. It's a yes and how, or a no, but how. The how is so important in this because you might think you have to make a hard decision, but it's not necessarily the case. You just have to try to be creative. And unfortunately, a lot of times that takes time. It takes time and discussion to catalyze synergy in these conversations. And, I'm pretty patient or stubborn, however you want to look at it, when we're in those meetings, to be able to sit back and say, hey, I'll do this all day and to break this down until we're somewhat on the same page. I don't think everybody has to agree. People never will, but I'll take pieces of what each person is saying and then try to incorporate them into whatever our final decision is. Because everybody's got something good to say. Everybody's perspective is important, and everybody's time is just as important as the other person. And looking at that, I think that that's where some leaders maybe go wrong. They say, my time's more important than yours. I need to get out of this meeting. We just have to make a decision. This needs to be done. But everybody's time is just as important as the other person. So you see on my notes, I have this Venn diagram of my win, their win, and then in the middle, in that sliver, is our win. You got to figure out how it's a win-win situation. It's not always obvious, and it's often difficult to work through.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I think there's also a fair point where you get to the end and there's still a couple of dissenters, and you say, well, made every effort. I hope we can bring you along with this, and you just move on. But, hopefully in a respectful way at a minimum. But that's a challenge. I think especially, I know in my own case, when I had my first company and had a bunch of people to manage, I always wanted everybody to agree on stuff. And sometimes it doesn't quite get there. But one of the things, and we've got to wrap up in a few minutes here, although just for everybody, I know you set aside an hour. Most people set aside an hour for this. We might go a few minutes over an hour, but you'll get a recording so you can watch the last few minutes in the recorded version if you'd like to. But what I was going to say is that I think this thing about I lost my track of thought. I'm sorry. I was just looking at the time. One other thing, one last topic maybe, which is in the context of being a servant leader, in the context of trying to support your people, what I've thought for a long time is that with the pace of change in organizations, is that a good mentor, a good coach, a good manager, especially at sort of the level of a team, or even if you're a senior executive and you've got your executive team working for you, there's an opportunity for you to be one of the biggest sources of continuous talent development, as they say. So not just in terms of management and having people listen to you and getting things done, but how do you think about the responsibility of managers or leaders to continuously develop their people?
I think it's absolutely one of their responsibilities and one of the most important ones, to make sure that things don't get stale in a relationship. You don't want to be sitting down for a weekly or bi-weekly meeting and being like, oh, we're talking about this again. Oh, we don't have anything to talk about. There's no topic. There's no direction. There's no growth. There's no progress. And one of the things that I like to do with people is I think that everybody has something that they do better than everybody else. And you introduced me to the term specialized expertise. It falls within the category of one of their strengths typically, but it's something very specific to how they do something or think about or execute. And using that as something that you can harness to reinforce it so that they can then exceed where they are now and grow. By setting goals and achieving them, measuring everything, self-monitoring, those are really, really important components there. But I always like to say that, there's areas where everybody's deficient, and coming to grips with the areas that you're deficient is difficult. But if you get those deficiencies to proficiencies, then you can take your strengths into the stratosphere and be unstoppable, because you don't have to be great at everything within the context of a role, but you should be able to do everything proficiently. And getting people too proficient in every area allows you to then focus on their strengths and make them absolutely, just like I said, unstoppable.
The cool thing about that is we used to talk about with fluency-based training and coaching that it's a lot more fun to do things you're good at. and you might want to do things you're good at. So there's this interesting interplay between your specialized expertise, something you really like. You may not even know how to do it, but let's say you like technology. So let's aim you at a bunch of new things that we need to get done for the team or the organization that are about learning about doing technology. So it's not only then you're leveraging somebody's strength, but you're giving them something that's probably a natural positive consequence. So it's a kind of a nice balance. One more thing I want to say, and it came up in our conversations before this webinar, but I want to mention it really to everybody, which is that going back to Matt's thing about, how to be sure people will want to listen to you and that you're respectful and all of that. Part of that has to do with the sort of proportion of positive feedback, praise, recognition, and the corrective feedback stuff. Now, I'm a nitpicker, and people who know me or have worked with me know that. I'm a guy that shows up with a red pen and says, "Well, that's pretty good. We got that right. But wait a minute, you got to fix this." And you can easily, if you're impatient and if you're focused on the mission, you can very easily slip into the thing where you're doing corrective feedback all the time and very seldom acknowledging what people do. Now, the flip side of that is that people do a lot of good stuff. So if you pay attention, you can find good stuff. And one of the simplest techniques I learned, you mentioned self-monitoring a minute ago. I learned this from Og Lindsley and Abigail Calkin and some of my other colleagues and mentors, of counting my own behavior. And there were a couple times in one company in particular where I got to the point where people were almost avoiding me in the hall because we were producing a lot of documentation and training, and I was being a nitpicker. And all I had to do was I started counting. How many positive things do I say? Hey, that was really good the way you do that. Not phony, real stuff. And how many corrective things do I do? And if I measured it the first day, it was way more corrective stuff. But if you're paying attention to that, in a couple days, you can reverse that ratio big time and so you're finding your people doing good stuff. And it not only makes them feel good, it makes you feel good, and it actually, quote, reinforces the right behavior. So that's something that we've talked about a little bit. I think it's worth sharing with everybody because,
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, the key with that is that you had to start looking for the things that they're doing well. It's very typical of managers, because they're accountable for their team, to look at the things that they're going to get corrective feedback on, or they're going to, get nailed on. And that's all you look for as a manager and leader. When you start looking for the good stuff, you get a lot of discretionary effort out of people, and they start going above and beyond. It's like, unbelievable.
Yeah, so we're at the end and a few people are dropping off, so we probably should come to a conclusion. One of the reasons I've enjoyed getting to know Matt and planning to know him better is that, to me, a lot of us who move into management leadership positions, we're focused on getting the job done, but we're not always reflective. We're not always saying, how can I do a better job at this? And the thing that I've encountered in you, Matt, and the thing that it's got me thinking is, and of course we use the 6 boxes framework, because how do I actually do this stuff in a way that works? So I hope there's been a lot of good chat here, and I hope that people have found this useful. I want to just end up with a couple of things here, which are again, coming back to this best practices framework. We've basically been talking about ways to do these things when we're managing and leading people. So it's a pretty useful framework. These are some of my takeaways. Matt has some takeaways in the handout, but starting with box 6, being sure to understand people's motives and preferences, being sure that check for understanding, be sure people heard you, sure they tell you what the expectations are. Something that I don't think you said explicitly, Matt, but it was kind of sprinkled along in some of your comments. Ask a lot of questions. It not only slows me down if I ask questions instead of my telling all the time, which I do very easily, but it also helps to clarify, engage people, give them the feeling that you're listening and you really are, and that kind of thing. Empathy, putting yourself in other people's shoes, is obvious, I guess. Waiting and taking a deep breath before you send that email or whatever it is, and then looking for the good stuff. And then this is a quote that Matt, I've seen before, but Matt brought to my attention. I love this quote. It's essentially about box 1. I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. So it's kind of a funny thing to say. Try saying that fast 5 times. But the thing about it is, it's about expectations. And so if we understand who we're talking about because we've looked at box 6, motives and preferences, and we've set expectations, we need to be sure that we check and verify those expectations. So just to finish off, we've got our open programs. We've actually got one that Shane Isley's going to do for people in applied behavior analysis organizations, the virtual coach, which starts March 3rd. You can find that in our Facebook group, Performance Thinking for Applied Behavior Analysis. We do our open performance consulting program every couple of months. The February 10th one is full. And then these are some information. This is Matt's website. Check it out, Desired Effects CS for coaching solutions, and some other resources for you. So thank you, everybody, for showing up. This is a lot of good chat going on in the group, and please come back next month. Appreciate your participation.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.